She found the perfume on her throat instead of in her house. It was Thursday, late October, and the dinner plates were still warm in the sink. The kitchen smelled like roasted garlic and red wine, and the dishwasher hummed its low mechanical prayer. Maya stood in the hallway between the living room and the bedroom, her hand resting on the wall where the paint had yellowed near the light switch. She had just walked her best friend to the door, watched her hug David a beat too long, watched him laugh at something whispered near his ear. And now, in the silence after departure, Maya smelled it. Not in the air, on her own skin, transferred when she'd embraced Sarah. Goodbye, Chanel No. 5. The same perfume David's caller had carried home 3 weeks ago. The same scent she'd found on the throw pillow in his office. The same fragrance she'd convinced herself was coincidence, was innocent, was nothing more than the natural overlap of lives lived too close together. This isn't fiction. This is how love disappears. One small truth at a time. Before that evening, Maya's life had operated on rhythms she trusted completely. David worked from home on Thursdays. His office was the converted sunroom at the back of the house, where morning light came through the windows and made everything look softer than it was. He took his lunch at exactly 12:30, always ate standing at the kitchen counter, always returned to work with the same mug of black coffee that he'd refill twice more before evening. Sarah came over most Wednesday nights for wine and conversation that stretched past midnight. She'd knock 3 times, always 3, and let herself in without waiting for an answer. She knew where the wine glasses were kept. She knew which cushion on the couch Maya preferred. She knew how to read the silences between Maya's words, the way only someone who'd known you since you were 21 could know. The 3 of them had known each other since college. 14 years of shared apartments, road trips, late-night diners, breakups witnessed and celebrated. When Maya married David, Sarah had been maid of honor. She'd worn dusty rose and held Maya's bouquet during the vows and cried genuine tears during the ceremony. When Sarah's engagement fell apart 2 years later, Maya and David had been the ones who sat with her on a hotel balcony in Charleston, holding her while she cried into the small hours of morning. They'd driven her home the next day, Sarah sleeping in the back seat with her head against the window, and they'd stayed with her for 3 days until she could bear to be alone. They were a constellation, 3 points of light that made sense together, that had made sense for so long that Maya had stopped questioning whether the geometry could ever change. She had believed that completely. The house they lived in was a narrow Victorian rental in a neighborhood where oak trees met overhead and made the streets feel like tunnels. The floors creaked, predictable places, the 3rd step from the top of the stairs, the hallway outside the bathroom, the spot near the kitchen door where the subflooring had settled unevenly, the bedroom window stuck in humid weather. The kitchen faucet dripped if you didn't turn it hard to the right. Every morning, Maya woke to the sound of David making coffee in the kitchen below, the grinder loud enough to shake the floorboards. He always made enough for 2. She always came downstairs in the same gray cardigan, the one with the hole in the left elbow that she kept meaning to mend, but never did. Her hair would still be damp from the shower, and she'd smell like the lavender soap they bought in bulk from the farmer's market. He would kiss her forehead. She would steal a sip from his mug. Even though hers was identical, they would talk about nothing. Errands, the weather, what to order for dinner, whether the neighbor's dog had gotten loose again. It was ordinary. It was safe. It was the kind of life that people built slowly, over years, one small habit stacked upon another until you couldn't remember what your days had looked like before. She didn't know then that safety could be a kind of blindness. That routine could become a screen behind which other lives were lived, other promises were made, other versions of the people you loved could exist without your knowledge. The first fracture had come 6 weeks earlier, though Maya hadn't named it that at the time. She'd been folding laundry in the bedroom when David's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Once, then twice, then a 3rd time in quick succession, the pattern that meant text messages, not emails, not notifications from apps he'd forgotten to silence. She glanced at the screen without thinking, the way you do when you've been married long enough that privacy feels like a formality, something that exists in theory but rarely in practice, right? Tonight was perfect. Sarah. I miss you already. Sarah. Delete this. Maya had stared at those 3 messages for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Her hands had gone still in the middle of folding one of his t-shirts, a gray one with a faded logo from a brewery they'd visited on their honeymoon. The fabric hung limp between her fingers. She told herself it was nothing. Sarah was expressive. She always had been. Those words could mean anything. A great dinner, a good conversation. Inside jokes Maya wasn't part of because she'd left early for a work event, some client dinner she couldn't skip, some obligation that had taken her away from whatever had happened between her husband and her best friend that night. David had been at Sarah's apartment that night, helping her assemble bookshelves she'd ordered online. IKEA, probably, the kind that came in flat boxes with instructions printed in 6 languages and diagrams that never quite matched the actual pieces. Maya had texted him around 9, asking if he'd be home soon. She needed him to look at something on her laptop, some setting that had changed, and locked her out of a work file. He'd replied an hour later. Just finished, heading home now. He'd arrived at 11:30. His hair had been damp. He'd said he'd stopped at the gym on the way back, grabbed a quick shower there because he'd been sweaty from moving furniture. She'd believed him because why wouldn't she? He smelled like the gym's generic soap. He'd kissed her before going upstairs. He'd fallen asleep within minutes. When he came upstairs that night, she'd already put his phone back on the nightstand, exactly where it had been, the screen facing down the way he always left it. She didn't mention the messages. She didn't ask questions. She folded the rest of the laundry in silence and went to bed pretending everything was fine. She lay awake for 2 hours, listening to his breathing beside her, watching the ceiling fan turn slow circles in the dark, trying to remember when she'd last said, "I miss you already," to anyone, even him. After that night, Maya began to notice the small displacements. David started going to the gym more often. 3 times a week became 5, then 6. He bought new cologne, something woodsy and sharp that replaced the one he'd worn since their wedding. The one she'd chosen for him at a department store counter while a woman in too much makeup spritzed paper strips and talked about top notes and base notes and lasting power. When Maya asked about it, he shrugged and said the old bottle had run out. But she'd seen the old bottle in the bathroom cabinet just days before, still a third full. Sarah started texting more frequently. Invitations for coffee, for walks, for dinners that always seemed to land on nights when David was free. The 3 of them would sit together in restaurants with low lighting and expensive menus, and Maya would watch the way Sarah leaned across the table when she talked, the way David's eyes tracked her gestures, the way they laughed at references Maya didn't quite catch, jokes that seemed to have context she'd missed, moments she hadn't been present for. She told herself she was being paranoid, that marriage made you possessive in ugly ways, that 14 years of friendship with Sarah meant trusting her completely, and suspicion was its own betrayal. But paranoia, she learned, is just pattern recognition in a body that doesn't want to be right. One evening in late September, Maya came home early from a work trip. The flight had been delayed, then rescheduled, and she'd walked through the front door at 4 in the afternoon instead of 8. The house was quiet in that specific way that quiet can feel wrong. David's car was in the driveway, parked at the angle he always used, the front tire just barely over the line of the cracked concrete. She found his phone on the kitchen counter, face down next to a coffee mug that still held warmth. A white mug with a chip on the rim. One she'd given him years ago, printed with a cartoon of a dog and the words, "World's okayest dog dad," even though they didn't have a dog. She picked it up without deciding to. The screen lit with a notification. Sarah. She's not supposed to be back until tonight. Maya set the phone down exactly where she'd found it, the screen facing down, the charging cable plugged in at the same angle. She walked upstairs. She changed out of her work clothes, hanging her blazer carefully in the closet, folding her blouse into the hamper. She washed her face. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for 20 minutes, counting the shadows the tree branches made through the window. When David came home, because he hadn't been home, she understood that now. His car in the driveway was camouflage, a stage setting, proof of presence where there was only absence. He found her in the kitchen making dinner, chicken with roasted vegetables, something simple that required no thought. "Hey," he said, kissing her cheek. His lips were dry. "I thought your flight got in later." "It did," she said. "Then it didn't." He nodded. He poured himself water from the fridge, the filtered pitcher they refilled twice a day. He asked about her trip, about the meetings, about the hotel. She answered every question. She smiled when expected. She ate dinner across from him and talked about client meetings and hotel rooms and airports, about the businessman who'd fallen asleep snoring on the plane, about the taxi driver who'd told her his life story in 20 minutes. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't want to hear him lie. Later, in bed, he reached for her. She let him. She closed her eyes and imagined she was someone else, living someone else's life, sleeping beside someone else's husband. Afterward, he fell asleep quickly, the way he always did. She lay awake until dawn. By the time the October dinner happened, the one where Sarah's perfume transferred to Maya's skin, the pretending had become its own language. Maya had invited them both over. She'd spent the afternoon preparing, the way she used to when entertaining still felt like joy instead of performance. She'd made David's favorite meal, chicken roasted with lemon and rosemary, roasted potatoes, a kale salad with cranberries and walnuts, the vinaigrette she made from scratch with champagne vinegar and Dijon mustard. She'd set the table with cloth napkins and the good wine glasses, the crystal ones they had received as a wedding gift and rarely used. She'd lit candles, 2 tall ones in brass holders. The flames made shadows dance on the walls. Sarah had arrived first, holding a bottle of Malbec and wearing a black dress Maya had never seen before, fitted at the waist, V-neck that showed her collarbone. She'd hugged Maya at the door, the way she always did, the way she'd done for 14 years, and Maya had caught the scent of her perfume. Sweet, powdery, unmistakable. She'd smelled it before, on David, in her house, on her own pillows. Dinner had been easy. Laughter came naturally, rising and falling like something rehearsed. They talked about work, about the election, about a documentary they'd all seen on Netflix about a man who'd faked his own death. They talked about a trip the 3 of them were supposedly planning to Asheville in the spring, to see the leaves change, to stay in a cabin with a view of the mountains. Sarah complimented the food. David poured more wine. Maya watched them both and felt like she was observing from another room, from another life, from behind glass. She noticed things she'd trained herself not to notice before. The way Sarah's hand lingered on David's shoulder when she stood to get more water. The way David's gaze followed Sarah across the room. The way they both laughed half a second before Maya did, as if they'd heard the joke already, somewhere else, in another context. When Sarah stood to leave, David walked her to the door while Maya stayed in the kitchen. She heard their voices in the hallway, low, warm, familiar. She heard Sarah laugh, the sound she made when she was genuinely delighted, not the polite laugh she used with strangers. She heard the door open and close, heard the October wind rush in for a moment before the house sealed itself again. When David came back into the kitchen, Maya was standing at the sink with her hands in the soapy water, staring out the window at the dark backyard. The motion sensor light had turned on, illuminating the fence, the garden bed where nothing was growing anymore. "That was nice," he said. "Yeah," she said. He moved behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, the way he used to do when they were first married, when touch was still uncomplicated. She could smell Sarah's perfume on him. Not faint, not transferred by accident through a brief hug goodbye. Present, strong, recent. She pulled away. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm going to bed." He didn't follow her upstairs. She lay in the dark for hours, listening to him move around downstairs, the television turning on, the creak of the couch, the kitchen faucet running, the house settling into night around her. She didn't cry. She felt too hollow for tears. The confrontation came 3 days later, in the kitchen, at 7 in the morning. Maya had woken early, unable to sleep. She'd made coffee and sat at the table with her laptop, pretending to answer emails. When David came downstairs, he looked surprised to see her there. He usually had the mornings to himself before she woke. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she said. He poured coffee into his chipped mug. He leaned against the counter. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not quite guilt, not quite defiance. Something in between, something tired. "We should talk," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay." She didn't ask a question. She didn't need to. "How long?" she said. He looked down at his mug, at the coffee inside it, at anything except her face. 6 months. 6 months. Half a year, the length of time it takes for seasons to change completely, for gardens to grow and die, for a person to become someone their partner no longer recognizes, for an entire relationship to unfold in secret, in the spaces between the life you thought you were living. Maya did the math backward. 6 months ago was April, spring, the time when David had started going to the gym more often, when Sarah had started texting more frequently, when Maya had started sleeping poorly without understanding why. "Sarah," Maya said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes." The word sat between them like something solid, something that couldn't be taken back or softened or explained away. "Are you in love with her?" Maya asked. David didn't answer right away. He looked at the window, at the morning light coming through the glass, at the oak tree in the backyard where birds were gathering, at everything except Maya's face. "I don't know," he said finally. Maya nodded. She felt strangely calm. She felt like she was floating 6 inches above her own body, watching herself have this conversation, watching her marriage end over cold coffee in the kitchen, where they'd eaten breakfast together 1,000 times. "Do you love me?" she asked. "Yes," he said immediately. "Maya, yes, I do. But not enough." He didn't argue. He didn't say that wasn't fair. He didn't defend himself or make excuses or ask for forgiveness. He just stood there, holding his mug, looking like a man who'd known this moment was coming and had been too cowardly to arrive at it first. She stood up. She walked to the sink. She poured the rest of her coffee down the drain and rinsed the mug. She set it in the dish rack with careful precision, exactly where it belonged. "I need you to leave," she said. "Maya, not forever, just today. I need the house to myself." He was quiet. Then, "Okay." He left 10 minutes later. She heard him moving around upstairs, gathering things, a gym bag, his laptop, the charger that was always plugged in by his side of the bed. She heard his car pull out of the driveway. She heard the engine fade down the street. Then she sat on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, and cried until her ribs hurt, until she couldn't breathe properly, until the morning light moved across the floor and found her still there, still breaking. The fallout was quiet. David stayed with a friend for 2 weeks. Ben, probably, from work, who had a spare room and didn't ask questions. Then he came back, and they lived in the same house, like strangers sharing a waiting room. He slept in the guest room. She stopped cooking dinner. They spoke only about logistics, bills, groceries, the broken dishwasher that needed repair, the leak in the bathroom ceiling that was getting worse. Sarah stopped texting, stopped calling, disappeared from their lives as completely as if she'd never existed. Maya saw her number appear once on David's phone, saw him silence it, saw him delete the voicemail later without listening. Or maybe he did listen. Maya didn't ask. Maya didn't reach out to her, didn't ask for explanations or apologies. There was nothing Sarah could say that would make the betrayal smaller, nothing that would return the 14 years of friendship to what they'd been. No words could rebuild trust that had shattered so completely. Some friendships end in arguments, some end in distance. Theirs ended in silence. Maya learned what it felt like to grieve 2 people at once, to mourn a marriage and a friendship simultaneously, to understand that the life she'd been living had been a partial truth, a curated version of reality where she'd been allowed to see only what they wanted her to see. She wondered how many dinners she'd hosted where they'd exchanged glances she hadn't caught, how many times they'd touched when she'd left the room, how many lies she'd been told that she'd believed because belief had felt safer than suspicion. Months passed. Winter came. David moved out in January, on a Saturday morning when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the sidewalks were slick with ice. He took half the furniture, half the books, half the kitchen supplies. They divided their possessions with painful precision, like archaeologists cataloging ruins. He left the coffee maker. She didn't know if it was kindness or indifference. Maya didn't ask where he was going. She assumed it was to Sarah's apartment, but she didn't ask. She didn't want the confirmation. She didn't want to know if they were building the life together that should have required more time, more space, more respect for what had been destroyed to make room for it. She learned to live alone in a house that had been built for 2. She learned to make coffee, for 1. She learned to fall asleep without the sound of someone else breathing in the dark, without the weight of another body shifting the mattress, without the familiar rhythm of a life shared. The house felt larger. Her footsteps echoed differently. She started closing doors that used to stay open. She went to therapy. She told the story of her marriage to a woman with kind eyes and a leather notebook who wrote things down in handwriting Maya couldn't read from across the room. She cried in that office more times than she could count. She learned words for things she'd felt but never named. Betrayal trauma, gaslighting, triangulation. Do you think you'll forgive him? The therapist asked once. I don't know, Maya said. Does it matter? It might, eventually. Maya thought about that, about what forgiveness would look like. If it would feel like relief or just exhaustion in disguise. If it was something you did for the other person or for yourself. If it required forgetting or just accepting. If it was possible to forgive someone and still never want to see them again. I don't think forgiveness is the right word, she said finally. I think it's more like acceptance. That it happened, that it hurt, that it changed me. The therapist nodded. That's a start, she said. Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in the South. One day it was 40 degrees and raining, and the next the trees were budding and the air smelled like pollen and new grass. Maya started running in the mornings, something she hadn't done since college. She'd wake before dawn, put on old sneakers and leggings that were starting to pill at the knees, and run through the neighborhood while the world was still dark. She liked the emptiness, the way the streets belonged to her alone, the sound of her breathing and her footsteps and nothing else. She cut her hair short, donated the length to a charity that made wigs for cancer patients. It felt symbolic in a way she couldn't articulate. Lighter, different. She repainted the bedroom a soft gray blue that made the light feel different, covered the walls that had witnessed her marriage, made the space hers alone. She ran into Sarah once in the produce section of the grocery store, mid-March, a Tuesday. Maya was holding a bunch of kale. Sarah was reaching for apples. They saw each other across the aisle. Sarah's hand froze on the bag of apples. Maya's grip tightened on the kale. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah looked different, thinner. Her hair was shorter too. She was wearing a gray sweater Maya recognized because it had been David's once, years ago, before he'd left it at Sarah's apartment and never asked for it back. Then Sarah looked away first. She set the apples back in the bin. She walked in the opposite direction without looking back. Her cart was half full. She left it in the aisle. Maya stood there for a long time, holding the kale, feeling something she couldn't name. Not anger, not sadness. Just the weight of what used to be. Just the understanding that some people leave your life completely, even when they stay in the same town, shop at the same stores, breathe the same air. David sent her a text in April. I'm sorry for everything. You deserved better. She read it 3 times. She thought about responding. About saying that she forgave him, or that she didn't, or that sorry wasn't a big enough word for what he'd done. About saying that she hoped he was happy, or that she hoped he wasn't, or that she didn't think about him anymore, which would have been a lie. In the end, she wrote back, I know. And then she deleted his number. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of a need to stop waiting for him to say the thing that would make it hurt less. Out of an understanding that there was no sentence that could undo 6 months of deception, no apology that could restore what had been taken, out of a desire to stop carrying him with her into whatever came next. By the time summer came, Maya had learned to live with the contradictions. She could remember loving David and also know that he'd hurt her. She could mourn the friendship with Sarah and also understand that it had been built on a foundation that was always fragile, always conditional, always dependent on boundaries that neither of them had honored. She could be angry and sad and at peace all at once. One evening in late June, she sat on her porch with a glass of wine and watched the sun set behind the oak trees. The air was warm, the cicadas were loud, their song rising and falling like breathing. The world felt impossibly big and impossibly small at the same time. She thought about the night she'd found the perfume, the moment she'd realized that the truth had been living in her house all along, wearing her friend's scent and sleeping beside her in the dark. She thought about how betrayal doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, through small displacements and silences that grow heavy, through text messages and gym visits and new cologne, through 14 years of friendship that could be destroyed in 6 months, through trust that can be shattered by a smell, a lie, a moment of clarity you wish you'd never had. She thought about how love, even ruined love, leaves marks that don't fade, how it reshapes the architecture of a person, how it makes them both stronger and more breakable, how it teaches you things about yourself you never wanted to learn, how much you can endure, how much you can forgive, how much you can survive and still wake up the next morning and make coffee and go running and repaint a room and pretend that life continues because it does. It does, whether you're ready or not. And she thought about the future, Not as something she was owed, but as something she would build alone, one quiet choice at a time. A future where she wouldn't have to share someone who'd promised to be hers alone, where friendship meant something that couldn't be undone by desire or selfishness or cowardice. The sun disappeared below the horizon. The sky turned violet, then indigo, then black. Maya finished her wine. She went inside. She locked the door behind her, not because she was afraid, but because she'd finally learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, and she'd chosen the one that let her sleep at night, retry